What we're going to talk about tonight in this our last session of Old Testament Survey, we're going to talk about post-exilic writings. And I'm actually kind of excited about this session, and I hope I just create a new curiosity, a new interest for you to read these books differently, because I think this post-exilic, post-exile period is probably the most similar to our current era, in that we, like Israel at that time, we are on the margins of the broader, bigger world and the empires and who is in power. The question is, how do God's people live in faithfulness to Him in the midst of an unfaithful age, an ungodly age, as they live among the nations? A God-fearing people among the non-fearing nations. That's the era, and that's what these writings, as well as a few of the others that we've already looked at, that's what they speak to. Daniel is a post-exilic writing, as is Lamentations, apparently. And so those also feed into that same. The post-exilic prophets we've already looked at. But these writings, the narratives, the histories, both before the exiles and then after, they're not just telling us what happened. They're telling us what happened for a reason. Now, when you read through Kings, and you find some kings doing well and leading the nation rightly toward the worship of God, and other kings doing poorly and making poor decisions. And when you read about that this king pursued idols and he trusted in Assyria instead of trusting in the Lord, what does that bring to your mind? It causes us to say, oh no, bad things are going to come from this. This is not going to go well. And the purpose of the historical narratives prior to are to explain where Israel is going. For us to look back at those and say, when they did these things, look where it led. There were some pauses along the way. There was some holding back, some turnarounds, and yet they continued that downward trend. And when we see that downward trend, it tells us, all the way from Deuteronomy, it tells us where we're going, off into exile. And that afterwards, there's a little different spin. There's a bit of a victorious, a restorative. Now, you have been unraveling slowly as a people ever since the glory days of David. Imagine that. And now it's eventually got to the point that first the northern cousins and now all the rest of you have been carried away into exile among the nations and among their gods. And they're trying to impress you with how their ways are better because your ways obviously failed. And then you're sent back into your homeland, that land that God gave you. And there's something in His Word that talked about being restored one day, returning again. And yet, not only is the temple a small resemblance of what it once was. Now, it's the same basic footprint size, but it's like building it out of bricks instead of marble. It's nothing like the former glory. And nothing about your national existence is anything like what it once was. And there's just a sense of discouragement in the air, of defeat and failure. And in the midst of that, the post-exilic writings are telling the story again, especially Chronicles. Chronicles is telling the story again, rehearsing the history of Israel, but from a restoration emphasis. Let's take a look at 1 Chronicles. 1st and 2nd together. I have the notes before you. 1 Chronicles in particular focuses on David. It's mostly about the life of David, but before we get to David, we're reminded of who we are and where we came from as Israelites. Now, we're Israelites reading this, so you want to take it from that perspective. But as Israelites reading this, and I mean that not that the church today are Israelites, I mean that we want to read this from a Hebrew Israel Old Testament perspective. So, we're reminded, yes, Adam, and even the fall of Adam, and Adam to Israel. God chooses Israel because of Adam's fall. He's going to restore humanity by working through Israel. First chapter, Adam to Israel. Now we have Judah and David, their genealogical record in the next 3 chapters. Chapters 2, 3, and most of chapter 4. Finally, at the end of chapter 4, we move on to Simeon. Chapter 5 includes 3 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. Chapter 6 is the longest chapter, over 80 verses, and it focuses on Levi. And then you have a whole bunch of them crammed into one chapter, 7, and then a bit more focus on Benjamin in chapter 8. And then chapter 9 focuses on, well, those who were restored, exiles who return into land, and how they're connected to these earlier family records. So it's important to know who's an Israelite, who belongs here, who can participate in the rebuilding of the temple, who can participate in the rebuilding of the walls. That's where the opposition comes in with Nehemiah and Ezra and even Zerubbabel in their initial return. The people in the land wanted to help. They wanted to join in. They wanted to be part of this. They wanted to make a temple of unity. They wanted to have a unity city that they could all have a part in, and they could, like the bumper sticker says, coexist. But that didn't work well before, and God's people rightly determined, no, we are going to worship our God as He's called us, and you have no part with us. They maintained their separateness. Okay. And so the genealogies show who's in. That's important. Now, what do you notice about the weight given in the genealogies? The first 9 chapters, the part you always skip right past. What do you notice about the weighting of it? Who gets the most press? David and Judah. David's family, Judah, gets the most press, almost 3 chapters. Now, again, not every chapter has equal number of verses, but this is the biggest chunk, clearly. After David, who gets the most press? Or after Judah, who gets the most press? I'm sorry? Levi, that longest chapter, 80. The priests and the Levites. So the tribe of Levi is not all priests. There are priests and Levites. Levites who serve around the temple, and they are teachers of Israel, but they're not necessarily priests in the priestly line. And then the next longest, the next most press goes to who? Which other tribe gets one whole chapter? Why? Why the focus on Judah and Benjamin and Levi? Okay, Benjamin and Judah. Benjamin stays with Judah. And the Levites and priests also stayed with Judah. They moved from the north back toward Judah when the split happens. It's an interesting actual part of the record, something we see as we go through here. In fact, we'll get to that when we get to the kingdom divided. But one of the things that you find, okay, the emphasis is going to be on David. And then the rest of the emphasis in 1 Chronicles, chapter 10, is Saul's death. Saul dies so that David can be king. The rest of the book, 11 to 29, is just a rehearsing again of David's history. David, the glory days of Israel, when it went well. What did David do? And so the faithful king, not a perfect king, but a king who walked in faith with God. A man after God's own heart. So the focus is on David. They're reminded of David. Just a couple other fun things about the genealogies. In chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, we find that Joab is actually David's cousin. Remember Joab, the commander of the army? They're cousins. And there was another commander for a time who had been chosen by David to command his army in place of Joab. And this was one of the unity moves. And that's Amasa. Amasa is also one of David's cousins, although he was a cousin. He was the son of David's father's sister. Both Joab and Amasa are sons of sisters of David's father. But Amasa is the son of an Ishmaelite who marries David's sister. So he's a little outside the family circle, a little more distance there. But there's these family rivalries. David is keeping his trust in his inner circle kind of close within his own family. But there's family rivalry. So when Joab murders Amasa, he's murdering his own cousin. A part of the family and political intrigue that we would otherwise not know. Now, Absalom's mother, given to us in chapter 3 and verse 2, Absalom's mother is the daughter of the king of Geshur. So David goes, Geshur, you may know it by its New Testament name of Bethsaida. Bethsaida is right on the north end of the Sea of Galilee, and that was the city-state of Geshur in the Old Testament. And David goes all the way north to Geshur because his kingdom has expanded, and he takes a wife from there as well. He's taking a wife from here, and a wife from down there, and a wife from over here, and he's building an empire as he builds, well, his number of wives, in a sense. But when Absalom kills his half-brother, he then has to flee. And where does he go? He goes back to Geshur. Why does he go to Geshur? Because that's where his grandpa is, and his grandpa will protect him. So that's his safe place of refuge. That's what's going on there, some of the background. So you find the highlights of David's reign. I listed them there. There's the moving of the ark, centered around the worship of God and the plans for the temple. David extends the kingdom with God's blessing. He numbers the troop, his confidence in troops instead of in God's promise. This is a different David than David facing Goliath, isn't it? Now David's counting the soldiers. David is putting on armor, so to speak. And God is not pleased, and it brings a resulting plague. But that plague leads to the future temple site, the place where atonement is going to be made. David organizes the stonecutters, the Levites, the priests, the musicians, the gatekeepers. There's a focus in here on the place of worship and how worship will occur, the worship of the Lord. What went wrong with the northern kingdom? Almost immediately. When one separated from the other, what went wrong? What did they do immediately? The high places. They set up altars in Dan and in Bethel where Israel would go to worship instead of returning to Jerusalem. They abandoned the temple in Jerusalem. They need to return to temple worship in Jerusalem. They need to not only rebuild, but worship rightly in the temple as had occurred during the time of David. So there's a lot of emphasis telling that story again in a positive light. Even the failures are included in a restorative way. That, yeah, David did the numbering thing, but out of that came the temple. That's where the temple was going to be. That's where atonement would be provided. David organizes armed forces to secure the temple. David instructs Solomon to build. The people give offerings to build. David dies, leaving the temple to be built by his son. And we like that because the temple will be built physically by Solomon, but a greater temple is going to be built by the Son of God himself. The Son of God, the Son of David, is building a temple. So we turn from there to 2 Chronicles. Let me advance here. I'll come back to that one. 1 Chronicles, we just talked through. 2 Chronicles, you have nine chapters on Solomon's reign because the focus is on, the promise is all about David's son. But Solomon was not that son. But Solomon does a lot right, and especially the emphasis in the dedicating of the temple. Look at chapter 7 of 2 Chronicles now. Let's see, 7, 1 to 3. That's 1 Chronicles. I'm looking at this list of names, and it's not making any sense. So here is the dedication of the temple. And as soon as Solomon finishes his prayer, fire came down from heaven, consumed the burnt offerings, the sacrifice, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The priest could not enter the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. When all the people of Israel saw the fire come down and the glory of the Lord on the temple, they bowed down with their faces to the ground on the pavement and worshipped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, "For he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever." Praise the Lord, for he is good, his mercy endures forever. There's an echo that keeps coming up through the Psalms, doesn't it? And here it is, the dedication of the temple. And that's a high water mark for Solomon. for sure. And he prays that prayer. And he even in the midst of that prayer, remember we rehearsed it with Daniel, that he said, and when your people have been in exile and in foreign lands, and when they turn and pray toward this place, not merely because the temple's there so they need to pray in that direction, but they're looking in hope in that direction, that place, that temple where atonement is provided for their sin, which has caused them to be carried into captivity. So all of that is packed into that. And so Daniel opens his windows and prays toward Jerusalem, even if it's going to get him in trouble. Solomon's reign ends in seemingly great successes, but then the kingdom is divided. You have Rehoboam, briefly mentioned in chapter 10. He's full of faith in himself, and 10 tribes are ripped away. But Judah, Benjamin, and the Levites. Look at 2 Chronicles 11. Can somebody read verses 13 and 14 of 2 Chronicles 11?
The priests and the Levites from all their districts throughout Israel sided with him. The Levites even abandoned their pasture lands and property and came to Judah and Jerusalem because Jeroboam and his sons had rejected them as priests of the Lord. Do you want the next one too?
Yeah, and verse 15 fits in there, yeah.
When he appointed his own priests for the high places and for the goat and calf idols that he made.
The goat idols and for the golden calves that he had made. Yeah, so Jeroboam has set up his own religion. He has no need of these Levites. The Levites want to teach Moses' law, and Jeroboam doesn't want that, because if the Levites continue to teach Joseph, or the law of Moses to the people of Israel in the north, sooner or later there's the chance that God's word is going to call them to reunite again. It's going to call them to return in repentance from the idols to again worship the true and living God. So Jeroboam also shuts down the teaching of God's word. He says that's hate speech. He forbids it. He excludes them from participating in the new religion of the new Israel. And so the Levites and the priests that live in all these other areas, they were scattered all through the nation as a whole, and they all relocate back down south to Judah. And Benjamin also. Benjamin stays with Judah. Benjamin is the one other tribe that the Lord has to continue. So actually you normally think about the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes, right? But the 10 tribes are actually 9 because they include 2 half-tribes. The half-tribe of Ephraim, the half-tribe of Manasseh, right? Joseph split into 2 because the Levites didn't get a particular inheritance. The Levites are scattered throughout all of Israel, and the Levites rejoin with Judah. And that's one of the reasons that the Benjamin and the Levites get the big play in 1 Chronicles then in the genealogies, because that's the biggest part of who's returning from exile. Now other Israelites from the other tribes can return as well. They are all under Cyrus's decree. They have opportunity to relocate there most likely, but the bulk of them come out of Babylon together under Zerubbabel and then under Ezra. And those will be the same ones that got carried away. Any faithful Israelites who relocated from the north like the Levites did, and of course Levites and priests, there are some of those that go with both groups and they're listed, and of course those from Judah and Benjamin. Okay, so you have Rehoboam. Rehoboam rejects the Lord and is humiliated by Pharaoh Shishak. In fact, gains that Solomon had made now begin to unravel. Pharaoh in Egypt, Pharaoh had hosted Jeroboam when Jeroboam fled from Solomon. Solomon knew this guy's going to be raised up by the Lord against me, and Solomon then tried to come after him, and he flees to Egypt. He's sheltered by Egypt. When Solomon dies, all of a sudden, when the young guy takes the throne, the guy who doesn't have any experience, that's when the upheaval starts. You see that over and over again. That's the story with Ahaz as well. And so during that time of perceived weakness, that's when Jeroboam is sent back. But Pharaoh encourages, imagine the politics involved here. Pharaoh encourages, hey, Jeroboam, looks like a good time to go back now. Now's the time. That promise God made you, now's the time to make it happen. Jeroboam goes back and make it happen. What has Pharaoh done? He has just weakened Rehoboam. And now he's going to come back and get Gezer, which was lost to Egypt previously. He's going to claim that back, and he's actually going to raid Jerusalem and the temple treasury, and he's going to get all of the tax income that was lost to Egypt during those years of Solomon's prosperity. So there's Rehoboam and Pharaoh Shishak, but Abijah, the king who follows Rehoboam, actually declares the difference between the worship of the Lord and Jeroboam's unfaithful adultery. He stands up to Jeroboam and he says, do not think your worship is like the worship of God. God is not going to give you victory over us because we are the ones with the one true God. And those whom you worship are not God. And so Abijah stands up. Asa continues in the faith of Abijah. Jehoshaphat follows them. So we're getting a different look at the line. We were not overly impressed by the kings of Judah other than Hezekiah stood out, Josiah stood out. By and large, after David, we weren't impressed, were we? But the chronicler gives us a different view of them. He doesn't show all of their failings, although there's some mention, although Asa didn't do this and that, but he continues in faith. Now, when he comes into trouble, he does trust Syria for help, as Ahaz is going to later trust Assyria. But in a positive light, Jehoshaphat is described in 2 Chronicles as a really good and godly king. But it's strange because he flirts with friendship with Ahab. He lets his son marry Ahab's daughter, which brings Jezebel basically into the palace of Judah. It was a terribly foolish move, and it plays out very terribly. That daughter of Ahab and Jezebel is this queen Athaliah, who actually kills off all her other sons who could become king, so that she will be queen mother and queen regent and have nobody else in her way. She would kill her own sons in order to have the throne herself. That's a Jezebel who is now, and Jehoshaphat, as good of a king as he was, he let that happen. He continues to partner with Ahab in Ahab's foolishness. And but again, here he's put in a very positive light. Joash restores temple worship. Uzziah starts well. Pride is his downfall. He tries to take the role of a priest. Ahaz trusts in false god. Hezekiah restores covenant worship. Hezekiah asked for 15 more years, and in those final extra 15 years he get, what's the name of his son that's born? Manasseh. And what do you know about Manasseh among the kings of Judah? He was the worst. No one was as wicked as Manasseh. It describes in Kings. It may even say a similar thing in Chronicles. But what Kings does not record, but the chronicler does, it's a fascinating story in 2 Chronicles 33. Manasseh, of all people, Manasseh is restored. What does that happen? Oh, here it is, around verse... in verse 11, the Lord brought upon them the commanders of the army, the king of Assyria, who captured Manasseh with hooks and bound him. Remember, Hezekiah stood up to the king of Assyria. And it was the Assyrian army that died. But Manasseh is taken with hooks and bound him with chains of bronze and brought him to Babylon. And when he was in distress, there in Babylon, in chains, he entreats the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. He prayed to him, and God was moved by his entreaty and heard his plea and brought him again to Jerusalem into his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. And afterwards he built an outer wall for the city. He does more, and so on. Manasseh is carried away in exile to Babylon, and then Manasseh of all people is restored and has a good final years of his reign back in Jerusalem again. What does that sound like? What does that parallel? Manasseh could be a little cameo of post-exilic Israel. As bad as you've done, As far as you fell, you too can be restored. If Manasseh can be restored, anybody can. There's a time when for somebody who comes to you grieved by their sin and sure that God is done with them because of it, tell them the story of Manasseh. That's what it's there for. Look at God's mercy and grace. If we confess our sin, He is faithful and just to forgive us and to cleanse us. And if He can even do that with Manasseh, of all people, there's encouragement there. Okay, so then it goes on. We have Ahaz, but after Ahaz we have Hezekiah to Manasseh. After Manasseh we have Josiah brings revival, but his sons are unfaithful, and closes in chapter 36. Israel falls to Babylon. But then Babylon falls to Cyrus, and the exiles are encouraged to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple in 2 Chronicles 36. So 2 Chronicles moves us all the way then from Adam to restoration out of exile. So you have this cycle of Israel, of humanity falls. And so God lifts Abraham out of paganism to follow and walk with imperfectly, but sincerely, the one true God. And out of Abraham, God builds a nation who will show Him to the nations, and they do a terrible job of it, and they are in captivity among the nations. And yet God restores them and sets them back to rebuild their temple because the pagans are asking them, would you please pray for us? Wow, look what God has done. That's why they go back, because Cyrus is asking these people who have been captured and taken away from their homelands, go back to your home, prosper there, rebuild your temple, and when you pray, pray to your God for me. Cyrus doesn't want to leave any God unturned. He doesn't want to take any chances. Cyrus probably had, like they did in Athens, the altar to the unknown God, and he's asking for prayer. But that's Israel's purpose, to make God known among the nations. And Israel, at the end of Chronicles, has been restored to their purpose. I just got a whole new love for the book of Chronicles in that kind of an overview survey of what it was meant to mean for these people at that time. Any other thoughts or observations or questions about Chronicles?
Toward the end, Cyrus sets funds available.
Yes.
It doesn't happen until Darius is king. And then, anyway, so monies were sent to Israel from the pagan.
Yeah, the temple treasuries are returned, all these articles of to be used in worship. Uh-huh.
Okay, but it also, it sounded like there was some funding.
Oh, yes. Yes, there's funding as well. Yeah, the royal treasury.
In some ways, I'm surprised that was honored. I know they didn't have anything, so this is probably appeared like a godsend, but it's in some ways unusual.
Yeah, and it'll occur again under Ezra. As we get into Ezra, the same thing happens again. Ezra is sent, and when Ezra is sent to again worship and restore proper worship at the temple, so that these prayers will be answered, and the king sends money with them. Buy the cows and buy the sheep and buy the things that you need to offer there on the altar for me. Yeah, he bankrolls the expedition. In fact, Ezra's in a bit of a pinch. He's given all of this gold to carry. It's like, this is dangerous. This is months of travel, and there's bad people out there. And yet I'm embarrassed. I can't ask the king to send a guard with us, because we've told him we trust in the Lord our God. And so what are we supposed to do? And so they split up all the gold among the travelers, or among heads of households. You carry some, you carry some, you carry some. And then they bring it all back together and they weigh it all out to make sure nobody kept any for themselves, right? No pinching out of the profits, out of the purse. And so they bring it all back together and weigh it all out, and they all return that to the Lord's service there once they arrive in Jerusalem. So let's move on to Ezra then. Ezra is an interesting book. It seems to, again, he's telling a history before we ever really get to Ezra. Now, Ezra picks up where Chronicles ends. In fact, it grabs hold of that first year in chapter 1, verse 1, the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirs Cyrus the king, and he sends them back to Jerusalem. Okay, so we picked up right where Chronicles ended. And in fact, a lot of people would suggest that Ezra is the scribe. Ezra or his associates not only write the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and Ezra and Nehemiah in the Hebrew Bible is one book, it's one combined history, two contemporaries, one slightly following the other, but in the book of Nehemiah, Ezra and Nehemiah work together. So they are contemporaries back in Jerusalem, and so it's actually one combined story. Because of the connection to Chronicles and the way Chronicles serves the purpose of Ezra and Nehemiah in restoring the temple worship and rebuilding a people and restoring the city where God will be worshiped and where a unique people will have their identity and be a light again to the nations, that this is the center of post-exile Israel and how they're going to prosper, that Chronicles is also written by Ezra. We have no way to prove that, but it fits together that way. So that's a common assumption among Old Testament scholars. Or I say assumption or conclusion. Okay, we get to Ezra. Ezra chapter 1. Oh, let me do this. Let me go back a few pages here. Whoops, right there. I want to put this on the screen for you just in terms of it, and I'll leave this up since you have the other Ezra notes. I'll leave this up if you want to. It's helpful just to see the whole flow together, because we're going to hear about Ahasuerus or Xerxes the first. We're going to hear about Artaxerxes. He's the one who sends Ezra and Nehemiah. We hear about Cyrus, who sends the original return with Zerubbabel and Joshua here. They rebuild. They're about 18 years or so after they're there, they're stirred up. Now, the reason the building doesn't happen initially, although Cyrus said to, is because all this opposition that they run into. When they won't build a unity temple, when they want to build a temple to the Lord alone for his people, they run into all this opposition. And think about it, a temple is built on the high point of the land, and the temple has walls around it to secure it. It has gates to control who gets in. The temple is in its own a fortress. And Nehemiah is going to double down on that when he's going to build walls around the city, around already the high fortress. Every ancient city of any significance had what was called the Acropolis, the high city, which was walled and further protected. And that was the place where the leaders of the city and the elite, the connected, the most important citizens would go in times of trouble or attack. You would go to the upper city, to the high city. And so if they're rebuilding the temple, they're building an Acropolis. And then later Nehemiah is going to build heavy, stout walls around it. And when the letter writing campaign begins that Ezra describes, they're using big stones and heavy timbers. They're building something big and solid. And when they've got a fortress out here in the middle of the frontier, then they're probably going to rebel. Add into that there were rebellions by Egypt. Egypt is at the far ends, for the far southwest end of the Persian Empire. They're the farthest away, the hardest to get to, and so that's the first to rebel. Well, one step closer than Egypt is who? Israel, Judah. So Jerusalem might do the same thing. Next time Egypt decides to rebel, Judah might join with them, and it's going to be an even bigger problem. And so the Samaritans and the Ammonites think biblical Jordan. The capital of Jordan is what? Ammon, the Ammonites. There you go. So they want to maintain Persians' security and stability over this region because they stay in power as long as Persia is in power over them. They're Persia's agents. And so they say, since we eat the salt of the king, we thought it good to let the king know that all of this is going on out here, and you really probably want to put a stop to it. So that's what's going on in the letter writing campaign that Ezra describes. There's a couple of other historical things. I mentioned that during this time, when those letters are being written, that there's other rebellions going on in the Persian Empire. Also, Xerxes or Ahasuerus, who is the one who marries Esther. Okay, so that's happening just before. That kind of explains why Israel has favor within the Persian court, doesn't it? They were almost eliminated, and now they're in fact, when Esther ends, Mordecai is prime minister. He's the new Joseph. And so it's not surprising that Nehemiah would be the cupbearer, who's not just an official taster. He's in charge of all of the king's preparation. He's in charge, in a sense, of the king's household. And he's a trusted counselor because the king's life is in his hands. And yet, Artaxerxes' father was assassinated in a palace coup, which was led by the chief of the royal bodyguard and was carried out in cahoots with a high-ranking eunuch, somebody like a Nehemiah. That's how Artaxerxes' father is killed. That's how he becomes king. Do you think he's a little it's a little dicey now. Nehemiah is going to make a request, right? He's going to say, I want to go to this Jerusalem and help them build walls around the city. Well, if the king's feeling a little insecure, a little paranoid, a little nervous, if things aren't going well in the kingdom at the moment, that request could be very dangerous. The king might begin to think Nehemiah is not loyal. I need to get rid of Nehemiah, not by sending him out to the frontiers where he can stir up trouble. So you see why Nehemiah is very cautious, very prayerful about how he goes about this. It's a very delicate time. Okay, and there's been all these accusations made that Ezra describes as well, all the way up into the time of Artaxerxes. Ezra's great at giving us the context in which all this happens. If God was not with his people through all of this, it would not transpire. They could not have success. Okay, so Ezra, the first decree, in chapter 1, and you can fit in Haggai and Zechariah there in the building of the temple in Ezra 1, 2, and 3. So there's that history. Chapter 4 is confusing because chapter 4 chronologically, all of a sudden we have new things introduced. We're talking about Darius, and Darius is here. Darius allows the rebuilding of the temple to continue, but there's all this stuff that includes Ahasuerus and even Artaxerxes that are described in chapter 4. And then we jump to chapter 5, and in the days of Haggai and Zechariah, we have jumped back here, stir up the people, and they build the temple. But what Ezra's doing in the record is that kind of stuff started here, and in fact it kept going, and he gives us an example of it all the way through. But that's the kind of thing that was also happening here. Maybe he didn't have as many of the details here as he had to that later letter. But he's giving us the tone of the whole time, and then he jumps back over to here again. So I gave you a couple of lines in your notes about that after Ezra 4. That in chapter 4, 6 to 23 are parenthetical, and then we jump back again to where verse 5 left off when we get to Ezra chapter 5. So there were again the days of Haggai and Zechariah. The temple is going to be rebuilt because despite the letter writing campaign, Darius searches the archives and Cyrus's decree is found in honor. Here's a time where the government records worked. And God uses that in order for the restoration. Then we get to chapters 7 and 8, and Ezra and company are authorized by Artaxerxes to bring a second group. Chapter 9 and 10, Ezra finds that the Israelites, once he get there, the problem is not just, they do need the teaching of God's word. And that's what Ezra does. They need that because they're going their own way. They're doing the same kinds of things. Why are Ezra and Nehemiah so uptight about this intermarriage thing? Why does that so concern them? That's what got Solomon in trouble in the first place. And when that practice spread among Israel, whether it was in the times of the judges, whether it was in the book of Numbers and the bronze serpent, that's what continually got Israel into trouble, that drew them away from their God. Exactly. Yeah. And so if you watch the Bible Project, I introduced one of the Bible Project videos at one point, and that's a helpful resource. But they find Nehemiah kind of difficult, and Nehemiah is too harsh in their view. I think they're just a little too Portland influenced, if I could say it that way. That they wanted us to be a little more open-minded toward people who are different around us and their different views and so forth. And we need to be a light, and we need to befriend the nations. And yet there's a line drawn here in terms of the worship. You worship God on His terms, not on our terms. And that's what Ezra then is calling the people back to. And they use that because that matter of very personal faithfulness becomes repeatedly in Israel's history is a core issue. That was the example of Hosea. And it's beginning to play out again. And so that's what Ezra reacts to. Look at chapter 9. Ezra chapter 9 and verse 10. And now, O our God, what shall we say after this? We've forsaken your commandments, which you commanded by your servants the prophets, saying, the land that you are entering to take possession of is a land impure with the impurity of the people of the lands, with their abominations that they have filled it with, from end to end with their uncleanness. Therefore, do not give your daughters to their sons, neither take their daughters for your sons, and never seek their peace or prosperity, that you may be strong and eat the good of the land and leave it. But after all that has come upon us, for our evil deeds and our great guilt, seeing that you, our God, have punished us less than our iniquities have deserved, and have given us such a remnant as this. Can somebody translate that? What is Ezra talking about? Okay. Yeah, Israel's unfaithfulness that led to this is why we went into exile. And yet, even though we didn't deserve it, you have spared us. You have given us a remnant. And shall we break your commandments again and intermarry with the people who practice these abominations? Would you not be angry with us until you consumed us, that there would be no remnant nor any to escape? Israel, don't you see what you're doing? That's what Ezra is describing here. And so then there's a covenant, there's a cleansing of the people, and that's the end of the book of Ezra. How to live faithfully toward God as returned exiles. As exiles in the midst of the land, living new, and not returning to the old ways. And then we move into the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah learns in chapters 1 and 2 of the pitiful state of Israel's condition, of Jerusalem's condition. He prays to the Lord, and then he asks the king. And I love that order. First he prays, then he requests. And he's fearful. He's hesitant. He's in fear that this could cost him his life. This is another one of those Esther moments. If the king does not extend the golden scepter, and I don't know that that's true with Nehemiah because Nehemiah is in his presence, but Nehemiah is looking concerned and troubled in the king's presence. What does he know? What's on his mind? Does he know of some plot or scheme against the king that is troubling him because it may work or it may not work? When the king asks him, why are you troubled? Because he's not normally troubled in the king's presence. That's a serious question. It's not just, oh, you look like you're having a bad day, my friend. You see, this is a big deal. The king is suspicious. Think about it that way. What's going to happen when Nehemiah then makes his request? So it's a delicate moment. That's what's going on in chapters 1 and 2. And yet, as you know, the king sends him and he goes, and the king sends resources and he's got authority and he's the governor, and yet he moves in carefully. He takes his survey, he evaluates the needs, and then in chapters 3 to 6 is the story of the construction and the opposition and the difficulties and the courage and the faith of Nehemiah in the face of it all, so that in 52 days the wall is built. And I was going to put up a picture of, have I showed you before the picture of the wall? A section of Nehemiah's wall where you can see how rough it looks? Does that sound familiar to some of you? Okay, I have showed that before, good. Okay, that because it wasn't great work. I mean, they had perfumers and priests out there working on the blocks on the wall, and they're cabbling it, and they're building it quick. If something's worth doing, it's worth doing poorly. That was Nehemiah's motto, I think. Okay, that they're 52 days they're getting it done, and yet parts of it still stand. Just recently, in the last year or two, they've uncovered new sections of Nehemiah's wall. But if you go to the city of David, you can see these old sections, and there's some rough rock work in there, but it still stands. So the wall is built. Now Nehemiah's governorship continues over 12 years. We learn that from 5:14. But most of those 12 years are not described in detail. The 52 days get a whole lot of attention because the good hand of God is upon them. And you're again a post-exilic Israel. Does God really care? Does God even know we're here? What are we doing here? The good hand of our God is upon us. And God intends again to prosper us here. It may not look like the days of Solomon, but God is good. And God has got us. God will look after us. That's what they're supposed to get out of this. This 52 days, it is amazing. Look what God has done. I think of our building campaign. Look what God has done. It is amazing. And we can be encouraged by that. In chapter 7 to 10, now having rebuilt the wall, Nehemiah as well turns his attention to rebuilding the people. Because again, these are returning exiles. They have been in Babylon. They have been in a pagan environment away from their temple. And they need to be rebuilt in their faith. They need to be reinstructed. And there are issues that come up that need to be confronted. But they're led in worship. They reaffirm their covenant with the Lord. They are God's people, chapter 7. There's a whole list of who the temple servants are, how worship, who's going to do what, who are the people that they belong. This connects again to those genealogies that are part of Chronicles. Who belongs here, and especially in the temple servants and the priests and the Levites and so on. Who is going to worship the Lord matters. And then they gather together for this reading of the law. This is a covenant renewal ceremony. Think of it in those terms. That just as Moses rehearsed the law with them before they entered the land the first time, now they're being restored to the land and they're all gathered in. And everybody come in from all the towns around about. Come back in, gather in. And we're going to hear again God's word to us. And we're going to affirm our obedience to it, our confidence in it, our trust in the Lord that He is God. And you hear the people. And in the midst, you hear in chapter 9 the repentance of the people. Fasting and sackcloth, and because they're aware of that they confess their sins and their iniquities of their fathers that led into captivity. And they read from the book of the law on and on through the day and gave us interpretation. In chapter 9, verse 6, you are the Lord alone. You have made heaven, the heaven of heavens with all their host. Verse 7, you are the Lord, the God who chose Abraham and brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans and gave him the name Abraham. You found his heart faithful before you and made with him covenant. You saw the affliction of our fathers in Egypt, verse 9, and heard their cry at the Red Sea. You see how he's rehearsing God's redemptive work because they're living in the next installment of it. That's the return of the exiles. They are living in the next installment of God's wonderful, gracious, merciful work toward his people. And then you have in chapter 10, there's a ratifying, there's these seals. Look at chapter 9, verse 38. Because of all this, we make a firm covenant in writing. On the sealed document are the names of our princes, our Levites, and our priests. We are in this together. The heads of all the families sign it. It's like the Declaration of Independence, but this is a declaration of dependence. They are affirming again the covenant. It's like they're back at Mount Sinai. That's what's going on in the book of Nehemiah. A covenant people now is restored. And so what happens next? Well, Jerusalem is repopulated. We have rebuilt the city. We've been rebuilding the people as the people of God who are to dwell in the city on which he put his name. And God is going to dwell there with them in their midst. And so you have that, and there's this the repopulation, and in chapter 12 you have this this grand worship that keeps referring back to. There's a dedication of the wall. There's the two choirs. Pastor Evan is certainly leading one of them, and there's two choirs going around the walls of the city and meeting up again, and there's this all the things that are done, and what you keep coming up here. According to as it was done in the days of David, or as David had set out, as David had decreed. They are returning to original worship when things were as they should have been. They're returning to 1 Chronicles, before the unraveling in 2 Chronicles. And then chapter 13 comes along, and how does the book of Nehemiah end? It's a strange note. Once again, Nehemiah the governor has gone away, and now he's come back. And Nehemiah is not a new David. Nehemiah doesn't seem to be of the tribe of Judah. Certainly he's not identified as in the Davidic line. But Nehemiah is a godly leader under Nehemiah and Ezra's leadership, but Nehemiah stays for a time, but he needs to go back to Persia again. The king wants him back. Maybe the king wants to know how things are going, wants to know again that Nehemiah is still loyal to him. And he judges that by being in his presence, having him there with him. And so Nehemiah's away for a while. When he returns, he finds again the people have slipped back in some of the ways. They have gone into the same kind of things that Ezra corrects earlier. Now there's a difference in time. Nehemiah is coming here, which is significantly after Ezra and his reforms in 558. Let's see, to 45. How many years is that? About 13 years. And then Nehemiah's governor for 12, so add another 12. Then he goes away for a few years, maybe 2 or 3 years. So it's been about 27, 28 years now since the initial reforms with Ezra. But the next generation, this sounds like Joshua, doesn't it? The next generation falls into the same pattern again. And that reminds us of one generation after another. You have a generation that follows the Lord, but when that generation goes, when Hezekiah departs, then you have Manasseh. When Uzziah is king, things are good, but when Uzziah dies, then there's Jotham and Ahaz, and they are not so good. And what is the next generation going to do? And we're seeing it again. And one of the things that I conclude out of this is there was a promise by Jeremiah. And you might by now be picking up on the fact that not merely was I asking you questions to check your knowledge on the quiz, I was reminding you of some of the key moves in the Old Testament in that quiz, because Jeremiah promises a new covenant. At the time when Judah is lost and Jerusalem is falling, Jeremiah, the Lord through Jeremiah, It gives the promise of a new covenant, when he will put his Spirit within them. He will give them a soft heart, a heart tender toward the Lord, so that they are able to walk in his ways. They are going to keep trying to yield themselves and submit to God's ways and his worship according to his covenant as his covenant people, but they will not succeed. They will not keep God's ways. They need new covenant enabling to live out the faithfulness that the old covenant required. They need new covenant enabling for old covenant faithfulness. But that's what's coming, right? That's where we're going. We're out here a ways to get there. But another thing that's happening here, well, I'll throw that in at the end. First, let's get to one more. We have one more. Oh, there's this really cool chiasm. If you like chiasms, I do. I think they're fascinating in what they kind of point to in terms of what's a centerpiece not to be missed. And here, if you put Ezra and Nehemiah together, this comes from my friends that other Old Testament survey, Dyer and Merrill. Old school Dallas guys, especially Eugene Merrill. Zerubbabel's return, Zerubbabel's return. The building of the temple, the building of the walls, and the opposition to it. The return of Ezra, the return of Nehemiah. What's centerpiece? The restoration of these people in covenant relationship with God. That's what the book of Ezra and Nehemiah is about. In the Hebrew Bible as one book. That's its purpose, that's its thrust. Living out as a people of God again to regain what can be had in living faithfully with God as Chronicles inspires them. So inspired by the restorative record of Chronicles, God's people are renewed to be his covenant people. As you heard me say as we were going through Nehemiah along the way, Nehemiah builds the walls because Nehemiah is building a people. The building of the walls is for the purpose of building a people. And it's those people who will show God to the nations. And we can make all kinds of parallels for Brush Prairie today out of that, can't we? Things that God calls us to. Even building. The point is never the building. The point is the building of God's people. And the building of God's people for the showing of God's character and likeness to the people around us. That they might know him too. All right. That brings us along to Esther. And again, a short outline for Esther. 3 points. Once there was a girl named Esther. Do you think she ever dreamed to be queen? Probably not. It's a strange story though, isn't it? She's a Jewish girl in the Persian Empire. And Ahasuerus, well, let me go back. A little more history here. Okay. Ahasuerus has just been attacking Greece. And he had great success in the land battles, but then he lost his whole fleet to the Greeks. And that unraveled, of course, the victories that he had gained on land as well. So he retreats home. His fleet is in shambles. So what does he do? Well, according to the Greek historians, he consoles himself in parties and intrigues concerning his concubines, his harem. And that's kind of what the book of Esther describes. This big party that he's having, it's over the top because he's trying to convince all of these princes of all of these provinces that he really is still in charge. He really does still have all the resources he needs, that Greece is no threat to him. Now, is Greece a threat to Xerxes, Ahasuerus? Well, not really. His bodyguard is actually his threat. But Artaxerxes is going to continue, and we're going to continue for ways. In fact, the Persian Empire is going to be strong until Alexander the Great comes along and when? Anybody know? About 332 BC, in that time frame. So that's another good 100 years here. So what he's doing, though, is he's throwing a party, a gala event for 6 months or so that everyone will know Nothing has changed here. Everything is still good in Persia. I'm still in charge. I can buy new boats and fleets and soldiers and sailors to man them. There's nothing to worry about. Don't even think about rebelling. Oh, that's going in. In the middle of that, what happens? His own queen rebels against his will. How dare she? Do you see now why that's a bigger matter than just your wife's not listening to you? It's a little bigger than that for the king, because if he can't control his own wife, how will he control all of these provincial princes? Okay? So it's bigger than just the little guy, little Weasley guy who's complaining, King, you better do something about this, or my wife's not going to listen to me either. It's more than that, although that's a fun way to portray it. So again, there's history going on in the midst of, we live in the midst of history. And yet, we've got to be careful that we don't let the history control us, direct us, drive us, that we're fearful of the things that the people who do not know God are fearful of. Again, that goes back to Ahaz. And those Israel and Syria that threaten him that if you don't join us against Assyria, we're going to take you out, buddy. Isaiah comes along and says, you don't need to worry about them. A couple of years from now, they're not even going to be there. And a couple of years from then, guess what? They weren't. God has got this. If you don't stand in faith, you will not stand at all. So I got to watch myself, that I can easily be caught up in all the intrigue and politics and therefore false hope of today. And we got to be careful. I find it fascinating to understand the times that we live in and what's going on around us. But we've got to be careful that we don't overanalyze and begin to buy into the game. We serve and follow and trust in the true and living God. So yes, Esther, along the way, in the midst of these events then, Esther becomes queen. And that is a fortuitous event. Because as it turns out, as Mordecai says, perhaps for such a time as this, God has elevated you to this place. You have been put here for such a time as this because you will be the one that God uses to preserve Israel. Because Israel comes under threat. In chapters 3 to 8, we see that develop and we see how it plays out. Haman's the prime minister. He's the king of Persia's right-hand guy. He's driven by pride and jealousy. He has all of this control, and yet he's bugged because this one Jewish guy won't bow to him, won't honor him. And so he's determined, in fact, that he's going to get rid of all these obstinate, rebellious, unhonoring, don't know their place Jewish people, in fact, throughout the whole empire. Now, Haman is actually an Amalekite, a historic enemy of the Jews. Maybe there's some of that in here as well, we're not sure, but it's mentioned, so we're probably supposed to get something out of that. But Haman, driven by pride and jealousy, he plots the Jewish people's destruction, chapter 3. Ezra, at Mordecai's urging, agrees to petition the king. She's hesitant to do so because her own life is at risk. But how does Mordecai answer that objection? I mean, it's a fair objection.
We're not going to get away anyway.
Yeah. Do you think that you would escape? Yeah. If all the Israelites, and it's interesting, Esther comes after Nehemiah and Ezra, and yet it's actually in time before. And yet in our English Bibles it follows afterwards. He tells her, and what else does he tell her? Does all of Israel's future hinge on her?
God's still in control.
Okay, look at verse 13. Mordecai told him to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the others. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? God has raised you up for this. Now, if you neglect what he's raised you up for, that doesn't mean God's purposes are going to falter. I'm sorry, I was in chapter 4. Chapter 4 from verse 12. If she falters in God's purposes, that which He has raised her up for, well, that might cost her. And yet it's not going to frustrate God's purposes. Israel is not going to be ended here because God has made a promise that He's going to complete. What promise might that be? Okay, the promise given to David, one of his sons would reign forever, hasn't happened yet, has got to happen. Israel can't be destroyed because God's promise to Abraham, or rather to David, hasn't been fulfilled. To put in those terms, then, God's promise to Abraham hasn't yet been completed and fulfilled either. So it can't end here, and that seems to be what Mordecai is saying. Maybe he's saying that in recognition of God has chosen this people. God will not let go of this people. But a generation can lose their privilege. They've experienced that in exile already. Okay, so Esther's answer then, go gather the Jews, hold a fast on my account. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, and we will fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. And so she's basically saying, I'll go, but you pray for me for 3 days. We'll be praying here, you be praying there, and then in 3 days, I'll go to the king. And whether he receives me or not, I will go. If I perish, I perish. I put my life in God's hands. On the 3rd day, she put on her royal robes, and in she goes in chapter 5, and she makes a request. He extends the scepter, and she makes a request. Does she request, oh, king, there's this plot against the Jews. Would you please stop it? No, there's now this intrigue that goes on. She's sensitive to the need. She can't just make a request and it will stand or fall. So she begins to work, and she invites to dinners, and she invites a banquet. And she's preparing a banquet for the king while Haman prepares the gallows. And in another twist, fun plot twist in the story, Haman ends up honoring, with the honor that he wanted for himself, the same man whom he plans to destroy, Mordecai, in chapter 6. And then in chapter 7, Haman is exposed. Further plot twist, the gallows that he built, that's what he's hung on instead. But there's still a problem, isn't there? What's the problem? The law still stands. And what do we know about the law of the Medes and the Persians? It cannot be broken. Where have we run into that before? Daniel, what chapter? Daniel in the lion's den, right? Daniel chapter 6. 6 chapters of Daniel's narrative, and then you have the visions and the prophecy. So, well, some of that mixed in the first 6 chapters, but 6 chapters and 6 chapters in Daniel. And that's the last chapter of the first narratives, chapter 6. The laws of the Medes. So the king himself is bound by the law that once he has signed it. And so he can't change that law, but he can make another law. He can make another law which has other provisions that allow the Jews to arm themselves and to go after those who would kill them. And so he does, and Israelites are given victory over those who sought to kill them. The Feast of Purim is born. And perhaps, as Esther chapter 10, I suggest there, is a tip of the hat toward Messiah's kingdom when it comes. There's prosperity, a tax on the land and on the coastlands and the sea, and all the acts of his power and might, the full account of the high honor of Mordecai, which the king advanced him. Are they not written? Mordecai was second rank to the king. He was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers. He sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all of his people. So something about Israel under Messiah, maybe, but echoes of Joseph under Pharaoh. A time of favor among the nations. How does Israel live faithfully to the Lord among the nations? That's what Esther is asking. Now, Esther was not easily received into the canon of the Old Testament. It was one of the last books to be accepted and recognized. Why is that? From your reading.
Does not mention.
It doesn't mention God. Now, is God at work here? Seems to be. And God is at work for Israel. That's part of the post-exile story. God is at work for Israel even when they are not at the temple. God is at work for Israel even while they are among the nations. God is at work for Israel to preserve them and accomplish His purpose. Though we are unfaithful, yet God is faithful, Paul says to Timothy, because he cannot deny himself. And that's a New Testament statement to Timothy, but it's a true statement about God. It is not new truth about God. And that's actually Israel's hope. Though Israel is unfaithful. It's what you can think about the Old Testament, really. God continues faithful to His covenant because He cannot deny Himself. And He will do everything that He said. Any other thoughts, comments about Esther? Any of the post-exilic?
How did they,
Oh, I was going to...
this version get ordered?
Interesting. Yeah, I make a note somewhere. Is it how Chronicles... No, is it... I make a note in there sometime about the difference in order. In the Hebrew Bible, Western thought versus, where did I put that? Oh, there it is, at the top of Ezra and Nehemiah. In our Bible, they follow Chronicles because of chronology, but in the Hebrew Bible, they're one continuous story. And I think it's something about Western versus Semitic orientation. The orientation of the East, the thinking of Israel in the Hebrew Bible is a matter of themes and topics. But in Western thought, often chronology is king. And so right after 1st and 2nd Kings, we have 1st and 2nd Chronicles because it's telling the same story. And right after that, we then throw in these other historical books because we got all the historical books together. That's neat and orderly. But Chronicles is a completely different perspective, and it needs to be gathered, and it's in not the former prophets. You have the former prophets, which occur before the captivity, and then you have the latter prophets, and you have the exilic writings, which look back after exile, and it's a different worldview. There's a reawakened sense of our failure and our inability. And yet God has been faithful to us in ways that we didn't deserve. And now, rather than living as God's chosen people in the land, and don't you, all you other nations, wish you could have what we have? Now Israel is the poor family on the block. And yet they have their God. And what the nations have cannot compare to what Israel has simply because they have their God. And He's really all they have at this point. And will that be enough? Now, one thing I wanted to point out in getting back, in this exile story, going back to our chart, there was one person way out over here. How does Esther make it into the Bible? Because the story of Esther emerges again right here when Antiochus, one of the inheritors of a corner of Alexander the Great's Greek Empire, when Antiochus seeks again to destroy Israel and to make them worship the god Zeus and to cause them to sacrifice swine on the altar and village to village for the Levites and priests that are scattered among and live among the people, forcing them in each village and town to sacrifice a swine on an altar to Zeus. And basically to coerce and force the people into pagan worship. He intends to ruin and destroy Israel. And the threat of Haman has reemerged. And Hanukkah, the cleansing of the temple, is not unlike Purim, celebrating again in this time of the Gentiles God's preserving of His people. And so Antiochus, I threw him into the mix there just because that's another example of what we've been reading about in these exilic books. That there are continued moves afoot to oppose Israel's return to worship. And yet, God remains sovereign, and God preserves his people. All right. Well, there's the Old Testament. All that remains now is that overall chart. To finish that and submit it, I wanted to give you a couple more weeks now. And again, it's Christmas this week. I understand that. I am completely happy if you put that aside and come back to it after Christmas. Let's say by the second week, after the first week of January, if I could have them all in by then, if you don't have them. I haven't got it in yet. And also your reading report. And the reading report, basically, I gave you that page out of your syllabus. That last page, it gives you to track that I did read these sections. I read some of the bits in the books as we went, and I read these sections of the Old Testament survey as we were going through them. And I've caught up a little bit. I've got a couple more chapters to read. Get that reading done and submit that, and then those are the last two things I'll need from you. Any questions for me? And you can send those by email, or you can give them to me in person at the church. Got one right there already, ready to go. I see that. Well done. Thank you. I'm encouraged. Any other questions? All right.